Excellent, thank you very much. So I should confess first of all that yesterday in preparation for this, then I did a trial run of the presentation, and my audience was my 13-year-old daughter. And she got the presentation, she got the key points, which was a good thing. And then she went with it. She added a lot more. She had a whole new perspective. But she's been at school, so she's not here. You have to put up with me instead. So you'll get the B version, not my daughter's version. But thinking about what we've talked about today, of course we have the big D word, digitalisation, which is sort of the starting point. But also, as we've heard with what's happening now over the next 3 years, with this move into focusing on AI, then to a large extent, when I'm going to be talking about digitalisation, then we can think of this as synonymous with artificial intelligence, which helps us a little bit, but on the other hand, it also makes things much harder because we don't really know what artificial intelligence is either, right? It means everything and nothing. It covers so many different things. It's such a big issue, big question about what do we actually mean by AI? And the kind of AI, digitalisation, what do they actually mean? This is a little bit of what I want to sort of get to in this session, which we will try with. So the concepts I'm working with, well, I want to talk about a binary between what I'm calling human locks on one side and human keys, which I'll explain first of all with this image. So how many of you are aware of the Better Images of AI project? Okay, very, very few. Okay, so this is a project. It's an archive. Their interest is in the visual representation of artificial intelligence, but also importantly, moving that discussion about what AI is beyond sort of hyper masculinized or hypersexualized robots, kind of glossy neon and that kind of thing, to talking about what actually AI is in practice. Now, I don't mean to sort of start this closing session of the day with a downbeat note, but I wanted to start off with this image because, so this image is by an artist called Catherine Conrad, and it's there to do, she says, to depict or describe digital isolation. That's not really what I'm using it for here. More what I'm trying to use it for here is to first of all open up the abstraction, to identify the abstraction between us and digitalisation in a lot of the conversations. So often we treat digitalisation as something which is separate from humans. It's a tool we might use, but we come at it in this kind of very isolated way. Yet, of course, what we know, and we've heard a lot in the other sessions today, is the importance of human relations in digitalisation. Now, that's not just the users, it's the developers, it's the creators. Another image from the same archive here, representing the various different ways. Now, I mean, on the end there, of course, this is easy enough to interpret in terms of that, how the technology develops through our use of it, how it collects our data, it develops, how algorithms are built on our data and so on. But also, we know there's a bigger story behind the way the technology is built, the whole industries around it and so on. Now, that's not what I'm going to get to in this talk. What I want to do is just stop first at the point of thinking about what are the humans in the machine here, what's going on in the background behind the interface that we describe as digitalisation. And this is where I'm trying to get to, first of all, with this, what I'm describing as human locks. Now, human locks I'm taking from particularly the concept of lock-in as Jaron Lanier uses it. So this is in his work, which is now over a decade old. This is a reprint. So if you are not a gadget, it's there. One of the bookshelves at home between what my kids are reading right now. So We have interesting conversations at home. Jane Eyre, quantum physics, it's all good stuff. And the interesting thing about Jaron Lanier's use of the concept of lock-in is this point that digitalisation is not created in a one-off moment. There's a history. It's there in the coding, but most of all, it's there in the earlier design decisions, also political economic decisions over what kind of technology we're using, what devices we're choosing to use. So to open this up first, what I mean by human locks is, on one side, I think all of us are very, very familiar with the discussion around biased data sets and algorithms. So we're very aware, of course, just to summarize that in brief, the discussion, of course, that suddenly digitalization or AI, that there is a problem where if the models are built upon data, they're only as good as the data, and we know, for example, in healthcare, that data is going to reflect biased decisions about who's had access to healthcare, which patient groups prioritized, but also, of course, we know, for example, that the vast majority of healthcare or medical science is based upon a very small segment of what is sort of, the population. Women, for example, are largely excluded from medical research. So most treatments that a woman will receive are based on research developed on the male bodies, these kind of ridiculous situations. So we know this is not something unfamiliar to us. But what I want to get at when talking about it in terms of human locks is the way in which the biased data sets contains decisions, earlier decisions. And by locks, I mean in the way in which we, through that bias, through that history, we are set down a certain path which limits how we can innovate. It means we're never just starting afresh. We're always making decisions based upon earlier decisions. And of course, we can say, if we think about also the broader design process, where in most cases, the kind of products that we refer to as digitalization, there's a question about how open was the design process? How open was it to, for example, the end user, marginalized groups, diverse parts of the population? How does that cover through to the kind of the mindset behind the purpose driving the development of the technology? But the other aspect is also, to what extent did the humans, when they developed the product, think about how it interacts with other technologies? And this, I hope, is one of the more interesting parts of what I want to present today, because when I'm talking about other technologies here, I'm not just talking about interoperability, meaning how one technology speaks to another technology. So, for example, the way data moves between an app and a wearable. But what I want to do, and I'll turn to this in a moment in more depth, is open up what we mean by technology as well. So I'm using this image here to represent a kind of a cliched and very problematic understanding of digitalization, because digitalization is often seen as something which humans may have debated how it's designed, but still it's seen as something which is very separate of society. We talk about digitalization in the abstract in many cases as something which we somehow have to reach, we have to accept, we have to convince the public to trust it, but it's still seen as, in those discussions, as something outside of society. Okay, so what do I mean by technology, what I mentioned before? So I'm doing something we always tell our students not to do, which is to use Wikipedia for a definition, but this one fitted my purpose here. So this definition then, technology is the application of conceptual knowledge to achieve practical goals, especially in a reproducible way. So what I'm asking you to do is to step away from the classic image of technology as being gadgetry, circuit boards, things that make electronic sounds, all that, And we think more about technology in this sense of that, yes, we have advanced expertise, we have the conceptual knowledge, and we're utilising it. We have a discussion, an organised discussion, to try and see how can we use that knowledge to produce certain goods, certain practical goals, as the definition has it here. So this leads to 3 propositions I'm putting here. So the first one is this, that regulation and digitalisation are both forms of technology. Each involves ways to steer human behaviour towards specific goals, and behind the steering wheel are humans. So let's unpack that a little bit. So it's a very common discussion at the EU level, in the US, globally, certainly here in Sweden, that regulation and digitalisation are 2 separate things. The regulation is seen as a barrier to innovation. There are those who argue, no, but regulation can be a good thing for innovation. So, often you hear the metaphor that, for example, brakes allow us to drive faster. That if we didn't have some kind of regulation, we wouldn't be able to do exciting things. What I'm arguing is though that still misses the point. Because it's not that regulation actually and technology are 2 separate things. Regulation itself is a form of technology. I'm speaking here as a political scientist. I sometimes do policy studies work. So it's natural, I would think, regulation involves some kind of intelligence behind it. But regulation, the way we organise society, it involves invention, involves innovation. So that's the first point. I think that's different to the way we normally talk about the relationship between these 2 things. The second proposition is that the risks of digitalisation, and again, I think you're familiar with these sorts of key concerns that pop up often in the news at the moment. So concerns that if digitalisation or AI, if it gets in the way of transparency, explainability, accountability. My proposition here is that these risks, which are often blamed on AI or digitalisation, are not due to digitalisation alone, but faults across the wider technology of society. So many of the things that technology, or in a traditional sense, digitalisation is blamed for, are not to do with digitalisation, but they are to do with wider issues over how we regulate society, how we organise society. And the third proposition is that technological progress, in the broad sense I'm arguing for, requires good design, noting that technology goes beyond circuitry and apps. This third one, given where I'm talking, is probably the least controversial proposition here, that good design is a good thing. But I think still, I want to emphasize this point that this is taking this broad understanding of what technology is. And that's different to how we normally talk about these things. So, brings us to the human keys. Now, the human keys, so many of the talks that take place here at Media Evolution, so many of the discussions earlier today, have in different ways talked actually already about these human keys, what I'm calling human keys. But just to go over them. So, I mean, one, of course, is just to have inclusive design practices. The way I often define inclusive in this sense, or participatory, is the extent to which the process exposes people to surprise. It's if there's not the chance that you might be surprised, if there's no chance of being surprised in the process, then there's no space for innovation. There's no space for doing something different. You just have an internal dialogue. It's very boring. However interesting your internal dialogue is, at the end of the day, you need to be surprised. Another point coming up from this is, of course, the need for diversity in innovation. By holism, what I'm meaning is referring back to that very broad understanding of technology. So we think of digitalisation not in separation from the wider ways in which we're organising society. We don't see it as separate of regulation, but as part of this wider technology. And also by community-based, of course, also I think that's come up in several of the presentations earlier today, so I'm not going to go into it in depth. I'm just putting these human keys basically to make the argument, and I take that from the discussions today, that we already have these human keys. We already know this. What I'm trying to argue here is that we can enable these keys, we can make better use of them if we take this broader understanding of technology. We question it, certainly an abstraction between regulation and a traditional understanding of digitalisation. So earlier this year I came across the work of Manuel Kocher, who's a philosopher. At the time he was talking about ecology, but that brought me back to his earlier work on the home. Now, very, very brief summary, but his discussion of the home is when we say, do you feel at home? Are you at home? Do you have a nice home? Rather than talking about the home as a fixed state, he talks about the home as a verb, or specifically homemaking. So to feel at home, and many of us have moved around a lot during our lives, whether within the same city or around the world, you think about the way in which, if you decide if your apartment, your house, your whatever, is a nice place in which to live, and people say, do you have a nice home? It comes down to, we learn that it comes down to not whether or not it's a nice place or a bad place, but it comes down to what you do in it, that you engage in a process of homemaking. Is an active process, little rituals that you have, little things that you do, that you and your loved ones do, little whether it's cooking, certain forms of decorating, whatever it is, little habits that you have. And when preparing for this and talking to Martin, it brought me back to this book, and I was thinking, what does that mean for this discussion of digitalisation? Because I think it actually takes us somewhere in understanding what is the human in digitalisation here. So what I want to open up here is to think through homely digitalisation. So the first point, so we hear in the news lots of cases of digital disasters. If we're doing a classic sort of presentation around AI and the risks and the threats around AI, then the kind of classic case that you might refer to would be a case where a system gets brought in, it automates some decision-making process in which the public asked to provide some sensitive information. The system comes up with an output that these members of the public are in some way bad, and that leads to them maybe losing access to certain benefits in society. Many of you will be sort of familiar with these kinds of cases, but there are several cases like this. And then you have stories of, because people have lost the benefits, there are, of course, mental health costs, people might end up going to prison later on, there might be a big media scandal, maybe politicians have to resign, maybe there are court cases. But in all these cases, what you always see is that the digital is not in isolation of the regulation, of the wider technologies making up society. In many cases, what happens, this is a repeated situation, is that you might have a process of digitalization which is designed to serve a specific purpose, but then the output is interpreted as if it was a human output. And then when it goes to the courts are like, well, we have to assume that the computer is correct. We'll just take it as the computer is correct. In no other aspects of life do we always assume the computer is correct. We know in our private lives computers can be very wrong sometimes. We work with it, it's a negotiation. But in a lot of these situations, it's treated as if the same as if it was a human. So in all those cases, often what you see is that the rest of the system does not adapt to the fact that we're now using a tool of digitalisation or a tool of AI, that we're doing things differently. The politicians don't act differently. They don't bring in new forms of accountability. The courts don't act differently. They don't bring in new ways of considering the evidence. They don't innovate new regulatory or legal structures to be able to make the digitalisation work as it is intended to work. So what I would argue is that in what are often presented as digital disasters, where digitalisation is seen as the problem, to always ask, what were the humans doing? What I mean by homely here is, well, what homemaking exercises, practices are the humans doing around digitalisation? If digitalisation is an innovation, but it never sits in isolation of other innovations. So what innovations do we see developing in the way overall society is running that make that digital tool serve its intended purpose? In relation to that is also just the point is to, when we look at any digital tool, we always need to ask, what are the relations it enables? It's going to connect people in different ways. Sometimes those relations are going to cross national borders. I mean, all the discussions around digital sovereignty, it comes down to that many of the tools we use may have been developed outside of the legal jurisdiction where we're living and working. So what do those new human relations mean for the way we work? Does it have legal issues, accountability issues? What does it mean? The point is here is just, rather than talking about digital tools in digitalisation, we need to understand digitalisation as a way of organising society, of organising human relations. And the third aspect is also, being that digitalisation is a new way of organising society, then we embrace it. But if those new relations aren't, for whatever reason, desirable, then we redesign the digitalisation. That's a fairly sort of obvious point, but it's something which is often overlooked because we pretend that digitalisation is something separate to society. We ignore that it contains social relations in terms of the values, the ownership structures, all these kinds of ways in which the technology is built. And this comes back to just that point I want to make again, that digitalisation is often talked about as technology, but that does not mean that the rest of the way we organise society itself is not technology. Regulation is a technology, and if we are to, when we talk about how do you regulate digitalisation, it's very much about how do we innovate regulation in ways so we have the social structures we see as necessary, as ideal. Okay, that's the thank you screen. Thank you.